At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law smirked and handed me a name tag that read, "Burden Guest." I sat in silence. When the priest asked, "Any objections?" I stood. The folder in my hand made her knees buckle before I even opened it.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
But let me start from the beginning, because the woman who stood up that day was very different from the one who had walked into that church just hours earlier. I spent 43 years as a registered nurse, 43 years of 12-hour shifts, 43 years of holding strangers' hands as they took their last breaths, 43 years of missing my own son's baseball games and school plays because someone else's mother needed me more. I told myself it was worth it. Every double shift, every missed holiday, every time I chose my patients over my own needs, it was all for David. My husband left when David was 8. Just packed his bags one Tuesday morning and said he couldn't handle being married to someone who cared more about sick people than her own family. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did choose my patients over him. But someone had to pay for David's college. Someone had to make sure he had opportunities I never did. And nursing was the only skill I possessed that paid well enough to matter. David graduated from law school, debt-free. He landed a position at one of the city's most prestigious firms. He bought a house in the suburbs with a 3-car garage and a pool. He was everything I had dreamed he could become, everything I had sacrificed to create. I was so proud of him, so proud of what we had built together through all those years of struggle. Then he met Amanda Wellington. Even her name sounded expensive. She was beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and better skin care. Tall and blonde with the kind of confidence that money breeds from birth. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels. Her mother sat on the boards of 3 different charities and had never worked a day in her life. I should have seen it coming. The way Amanda's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The way she asked questions about my work with just a hint, too much fascination, as if nursing was some quaint hobby rather than the profession that had built David's entire future. The way she subtly steered conversations away whenever I mentioned my years at the hospital. "Mom works so hard," David would say proudly in those early days. "She's been taking care of people her whole life." "How noble," Amanda would reply, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that should have been a warning. "It must be so fulfilling to help people who can't help themselves." The changes started small. David began canceling our weekly Sunday dinners, claiming Amanda had planned something special or that they were too tired from their social obligations. When I did see them, Amanda would dominate the conversation with stories about charity galas and country club events, speaking in a language of privilege that deliberately excluded me. "You simply must try the new restaurant downtown Madison," she would say, using my first name in a way that somehow diminished me. "Though I suppose it's quite expensive, not really the sort of place where nurses typically dine." David never seemed to notice these small cuts, or maybe he chose not to notice. Maybe it was easier to pretend his mother and his fiancé were getting along just fine. The real shift came when they got engaged. Suddenly, I wasn't invited to the engagement party because it was intimate family only. When I pointed out that I was family, Amanda explained that by family, she meant people who would be comfortable at the country club. She didn't want me to feel out of place. "Mom, you understand, right?" David asked when he called to break the news. "It's just a small gathering. Very formal. You'd probably be bored anyway." I understood perfectly. I understood that the woman my son planned to marry was ashamed of me. I understood that my years of sacrifice, my decades of hard work, my entire life's dedication to giving David opportunities had somehow made me an embarrassment to him. But I said nothing. What was I supposed to say? That his fiancée was manipulating him? That she was systematically removing me from his life? David was happy. For the first time since his father left, I saw genuine joy in my son's eyes. How could I be the one to take that away? So I smiled and said I understood. I congratulated them on their engagement and told them I couldn't wait for the wedding. I pretended not to notice when they changed their phone numbers and forgot to give me the new ones. I pretended it didn't hurt when David started calling less and less, until our conversations became monthly check-ins that felt more like obligations than genuine connection. The wedding invitation arrived 3 weeks before the ceremony. A beautiful cream-colored card with gold embossing that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. My name was spelled correctly, but I noticed I wasn't listed as mother of the groom. Instead, I was simply Madison Chen, as if I were a distant family friend rather than the woman who had raised the man getting married. I bought a new dress for the occasion. Nothing fancy. I couldn't afford fancy, but something dignified and appropriate. Navy blue with a subtle pattern, the kind of dress that wouldn't draw attention but wouldn't embarrass anyone either. I spent more than I should have, dipping into my meager retirement savings, but I wanted to look nice for David's special day. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at St. Matthew's Church 30 minutes early. I wanted to find a good seat, somewhere I could see David's face when Amanda walked down the aisle. I wanted to witness the moment my son became a husband, to be part of this milestone that marked the success of everything I had worked toward. Amanda was standing at the entrance, greeting guests with her wedding coordinator. She looked absolutely stunning in her designer gown, every inch the perfect bride. When she saw me approaching, her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Madison," she said, her voice carrying that familiar false warmth, "you look nice." The pause before nice was deliberate, a tiny hesitation that somehow made the compliment feel like an insult. But it was what happened next that I will never forget. Amanda reached into a small basket held by her wedding coordinator and pulled out a name tag. Not the elegant placards that the other guests were receiving, but a simple adhesive name tag like the ones we used at hospital meetings. Written across it in Amanda's perfect handwriting were the words, "Burden Guest." She handed it to me with that same smile, as if she were giving me a gift. "Just so the staff knows who you are," she explained sweetly. "We've had to make some last-minute adjustments to the seating arrangements." I stared at the name tag in my hands. Burden Guest. Not Madison Chen, not mother of the groom, just burden guest, as if my entire identity could be reduced to those two words, as if my presence at my own son's wedding was something to be endured rather than celebrated. I should have torn it up. I should have walked away. I should have demanded to speak to David immediately. Instead, I peeled off the backing and stuck it to my dress, right over my heart. I smiled at Amanda and thanked her for taking care of the details. Because in that moment, I realized something important. Amanda had just shown me exactly who she was, and more importantly, she had shown me exactly what she thought of me. This wasn't about seating arrangements or wedding logistics. This was about power. This was about putting me in my place, about making sure I understood my role in their new life together. But what Amanda didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent the last year taking care of someone who knew exactly who she was. Someone who had been looking for her for a very long time. Someone who had left me something that would change everything. The ceremony was beautiful, I have to admit. David looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his face glowing with happiness as Amanda walked down the aisle. I sat in the back row, my burden guest name tag clearly visible to anyone who cared to look, and watched my son promise to love and honor a woman who had just publicly humiliated his mother. When Father Mackenzie asked if anyone had any objections to the union, the church fell silent. It was one of those moments that exists in wedding ceremonies more as tradition than expectation. Nobody ever actually objects. Nobody ever stands up and stops a wedding. Except this time, someone did. I stood up slowly, my hand reaching into my purse to retrieve the manila folder I had carried with me. The folder that contained documents Amanda had assumed would never see the light of day. The folder that held the key to everything she had tried so hard to hide. When Amanda turned to see who had dared to interrupt her perfect moment, her eyes found mine across the crowded church. Her face went white as fresh snow when she saw the folder in my hands. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab David's arm to steady herself. Because Amanda Wellington knew exactly what was in that folder, and she knew that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. Standing in that church, folder in hand, I could see the exact moment Amanda realized her perfect facade was about to crumble. But to understand why that folder terrified her so much, I need to tell you about the 2 years leading up to this moment. 2 years of watching my relationship with David slowly dissolve under Amanda's careful manipulation. It started the week after their engagement. David called to invite me to dinner, something that had become increasingly rare since Amanda entered his life. "Just the three of us," he said, and I could hear the hope in his voice. "Amanda wants to get to know you better." I should have been suspicious. Amanda had already made it clear she considered me an inconvenience at best, but I was desperate for any chance to connect with my future daughter-in-law, to find some common ground that might preserve my relationship with my son. They chose the restaurant, of course. Some trendy place downtown where the cheapest entree cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week. Amanda arrived 20 minutes late, her apology delivered with a breathless charm that somehow made her tardiness seem endearing rather than rude. "I'm so sorry, Madison," she said, sliding into the booth beside David. "I was at the spa and completely lost track of time. You understand how it is." I didn't understand, actually. I had never been to a spa in my life, but I smiled and said it was fine, because what else was I supposed to do? The conversation that followed was masterful in its subtlety. Amanda asked about my work with genuine seeming interest, encouraging me to share stories from my decades at the hospital. She laughed at the right moments, gasped with appropriate sympathy at the sad parts, and generally gave every impression of being fascinated by my experiences. "You must have seen so much suffering," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "How do you handle being around so much? Unpleasantness? All the time?" "It's not unpleasant," I replied, perhaps a bit more sharply than I intended. "It's meaningful work. Helping people in their most vulnerable moments is a privilege." "Of course," Amanda agreed quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that I could never do what you do. All those sick people, all that sadness. It would be too depressing for me." David jumped in then, defending his mother's career with the kind of pride that made my heart swell. But Amanda had planted her seed. She had introduced the idea that my life's work was somehow tragic, that I was a woman surrounded by suffering and sadness. As the evening progressed, she continued this theme in ways so subtle I almost didn't notice. When I mentioned enjoying quiet evenings at home, she expressed concern that I might be lonely. When I talked about my small apartment, she worried that I wasn't living up to my full potential. When I mentioned watching old movies, she suggested that perhaps I was dwelling too much in the past. "David's told me how much you sacrificed for his education," she said as we waited for dessert. "You must be so proud of how successful he's become, though I sometimes worry that you might feel left behind as he moves into this new phase of his life. Left behind. As if David's success meant my own obsolescence, as if the natural progression of life required him to abandon the woman who had made his achievements possible." David didn't seem to notice the poison wrapped in Amanda's concern. He heard caring and sensitivity where I heard calculation and manipulation. By the end of the evening, he was looking at me with a new kind of attention, the sort of watchful worry you might direct toward an aging parent who could no longer be trusted to manage their own affairs. The dinners that followed became less frequent and more awkward. Amanda would arrive with stories about David's stress at work, his concerns about various family obligations, his need for space to focus on his career. She never directly suggested that I was part of that stress, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Maybe we should give David some breathing room," she would say with false concern. "You know how hard he works. The last thing he needs is to worry about entertaining family when he's trying to make partner." Entertaining family, as if spending time with his mother was a burden rather than a pleasure. The cancellations started small. A missed Sunday dinner here, a postponed coffee date there, always with apologies, always with reasonable explanations. David was working late. David had a client emergency. David was feeling under the weather and didn't want to get me sick. But I began to notice a pattern. These cancellations coincided with events in Amanda's social calendar. The Sunday dinner that was canceled because David was sick. I saw photos on Amanda's social media of them at a charity brunch that same afternoon. The coffee date that was postponed due to work? They were at the country club playing tennis. When I tried to discuss this with David, he became defensive in a way that was completely unlike him. "Mom, you're being paranoid," he said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "Amanda's not trying to keep us apart. She's actually the one who suggested we call you more often." "But we don't call more often," I pointed out. We talk less now than we did before you met her." "That's not true," David replied, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We talk all the time." "When was the last time we had dinner together? Just the two of us?" There was a long pause. "I've been busy, Mom. You know how demanding my job is." "You've always been busy, sweetheart, but you used to make time." Another pause. "Amanda thinks maybe you're feeling left out because I'm getting married. She's worried about you. We both are." There it was, Amanda's masterpiece. She had convinced my son that his mother was pathetic and needy, that my desire to maintain our relationship was actually unhealthy dependency. She had reframed my love as neediness, my presence as pressure, my concern as paranoia. The isolation accelerated after that conversation. Phone calls became brief check-ins focused on my health and emotional well-being. David would ask if I was taking care of myself, if I was getting out of the apartment, if I might benefit from talking to someone about my adjustment issues. I realized what Amanda was doing, but I felt powerless to stop it. Every attempt to address the situation directly backfired. When I expressed concern about Amanda's influence, David accused me of being jealous. When I pointed out that our relationship had changed since his engagement, he suggested I was having trouble accepting his independence. When I tried to explain how his fiancé's comments made me feel, he told me I was being too sensitive. Amanda was brilliant at this. She never said anything directly cruel. She never openly criticized me or forbade David from seeing me. Instead, she created an atmosphere of constant, low-level toxicity that made every interaction between David and me feel strained and difficult. She would make comments about how tired David looked after visiting me, as if spending time with his mother was emotionally draining. She would express concern about my living situation, my finances, my social isolation, painting me as a burden that David felt obligated to manage. She would praise other families where adult children had healthy boundaries with their parents, implying that our relationship was somehow inappropriate. Most effectively, she would create conflicts between us by misunderstanding things I said or did. She would tell David that I had seemed upset about something when I hadn't been, or that I had made comments I had never made, or that I had been critical of her in ways that were complete fabrications. "Your mother seemed a little judgmental about the wedding budget," she would say, when I had never discussed the wedding budget at all. "I hope she doesn't think we're being extravagant." "She made some comment about my family," Amanda would report, when I had done nothing but speak kindly about the Wellingtons. "I'm not sure what I did to offend her." David, trusting and loving, believed every word. Why wouldn't he? He had no reason to suspect that the woman he loved was systematically destroying his relationship with his mother. And each fabricated conflict made it easier to justify spending less time with me, easier to accept Amanda's suggestions that I was becoming difficult and demanding. The final blow came 8 months before the wedding. David called to tell me that he and Amanda had decided to spend Christmas with her family in Colorado. "It's nothing personal, Mom," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Her parents have this big family tradition, and it means a lot to Amanda. We'll see you for New Year's or something." I had spent every Christmas of David's life creating our own traditions. We had our special breakfast, our gift exchange, our quiet moments together, reflecting on the year that had passed. Christmas was ours, the one day when work and obligations and the outside world couldn't intrude. "What about our traditions?" I asked, hearing the hurt in my own voice despite my efforts to hide it. "Mom, I'm getting married. Things are going to change. You have to understand that." I understood perfectly. I understood that Amanda had successfully convinced my son that maintaining a relationship with his mother was incompatible with his new life. I understood that I was being erased, one holiday and one conversation at a time. After that phone call, I sat in my small apartment and cried harder than I had since my husband left. 25 years of single motherhood, of sacrifice and struggle and unwavering dedication. And it had come to this. My son was choosing his fiancé's comfort over his mother's feelings, and he had been manipulated into believing it was the right thing to do. But I wasn't completely powerless. Because while Amanda had been busy poisoning my relationship with David, I had been working at Mercy General Hospital, caring for patients in the extended care wing, patients whose families had written them off, whose relatives visited rarely, if at all. One of those patients was an elderly woman who had been abandoned by her granddaughter, a woman who had spent months telling me about her family, about the money she had saved, about the will she had written and rewritten, trying to find someone worthy of her legacy, a woman named Eleanor Wellington, Amanda's grandmother, the grandmother Amanda had told everyone was dead. Eleanor Wellington arrived at Mercy General on a cold Tuesday morning in March, 2 years before David's wedding. She was 84 years old, frail from a stroke that had left her partially paralyzed on her left side, and according to her intake paperwork, she had no living relatives. I was assigned as her primary nurse, which meant I would be responsible for her daily care, her medications, and her emotional well-being during what everyone assumed would be her final months. Eleanor was what we called a difficult patient, demanding, particular about her routines, and prone to long complaints about the quality of care she was receiving. Most of the staff avoided spending extra time with her, but I had learned, over 4 decades of nursing, that difficult patients were usually just frightened patients, and Eleanor Wellington was very frightened indeed. "They all think I'm dying," she told me during my first week caring for her. Her voice was strong despite her physical frailty, with the crisp pronunciation that comes from expensive education and social privilege. "Maybe I am dying, but I'm not dead yet, and I refuse to be treated like I am." Eleanor had been transferred from a private care facility after her insurance stopped covering her stay. The transition paperwork indicated she had exhausted her savings and had no family members willing to take financial responsibility for her continued care. She would be a Medicaid patient now, dependent on government funding for her basic needs. "Tell me about your family," I said one afternoon while helping her with physical therapy exercises. It was a standard conversation starter, something to distract patients from discomfort and help me understand their background. Eleanor's face darkened. "I don't have family, not anymore." "The paperwork says you have a granddaughter, Amanda." The name came out like a curse. "Amanda doesn't acknowledge my existence. She told everyone I died 3 years ago. I thought Eleanor might be confused, a common side effect of stroke recovery. But as she continued talking over the following weeks, her story remained consistent and detailed in ways that suggested complete mental clarity. "Amanda's mother was my only child," Eleanor explained. "Patricia died in a car accident when Amanda was 16. I raised that girl from a teenager into a woman. I paid for her college, her graduate school, her wedding to that first husband. I gave her everything. What happened between you two?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the hospital parking lot. "I got old. I became inconvenient. Amanda was building her social life, making connections with the right people, and an elderly grandmother didn't fit the image she wanted to project." The story that emerged over countless conversations was heartbreakingly familiar. Amanda had gradually distanced herself from Eleanor after college, citing busy schedules and social obligations. She visited less frequently, called less often, and eventually stopped including Eleanor in family events altogether. "She would bring men around when she was dating," Eleanor said with bitter clarity. "Rich men, successful men, and I could see how she would minimize my presence, introduce me as someone from the old neighborhood rather than her grandmother. She was ashamed of me, of my age, of my needs. When Eleanor had her stroke, Amanda had made a show of finding her the best private care facility money could buy. But she had also spread the story among her social circle that Eleanor had died, using the stroke as a convenient cover story for her grandmother's disappearance from her life. "She visits once a month," Eleanor told me, her voice hollow with pain. "Always on the same day, always at the same time. She calls it her charity work. She brings flowers and stays exactly 30 minutes, making conversation like she's visiting a distant acquaintance rather than family." I had been caring for Eleanor for 6 months when Amanda made her first appearance during my shift. I recognized her immediately from David's description, though seeing her in person was somehow more jarring than I had expected. She was every bit as beautiful and polished as my son had described, but there was something cold about her perfection. something calculating in the way she moved through the hospital corridors. She walked into Eleanor's room like she was attending a business meeting, carrying a bouquet of flowers that looked expensive but impersonal. She kissed Eleanor's forehead with the mechanical affection of someone performing a duty rather than expressing genuine caring. "Hello, grandmother," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with careful attention to her posture. "How are you feeling today?" I busied myself with Eleanor's chart, trying to remain invisible while observing this family interaction. What I witnessed was devastating in its coldness. Amanda spoke to Eleanor like she was addressing a child or a mental patient, using that overly bright tone people employ when they're trying to appear caring while maintaining emotional distance. "I brought you some lovely flowers," Amanda said, arranging the bouquet in a vase with efficient movements. "The nurses will help you enjoy them." "Thank you, dear," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully neutral. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but she maintained her dignity with the kind of practiced grace that comes from years of social disappointment. Amanda spent the required 30 minutes discussing neutral topics: the weather, the hospital food, general inquiries about Eleanor's health. She never asked about Eleanor's emotional state, her fears, her memories, or her needs. She never touched her grandmother except for that perfunctory kiss at the beginning and end of each visit. When Amanda left, Eleanor would always cry. Not dramatically, not with sobbing or wailing, but with the quiet tears of someone who has learned not to expect better, but still feels the pain of abandonment. "She used to be such a sweet child," Eleanor would tell me after these visits. "Curious about everything, full of dreams and plans. I don't know when she became this stranger who visits me out of obligation." As I got to know Eleanor better, I began to understand the full scope of what Amanda had done. Eleanor wasn't just a wealthy old woman who had been abandoned by an ungrateful granddaughter. She was a woman who had built a fortune through decades of careful investment and business acumen, someone who had planned to leave her entire estate to the granddaughter she had raised and loved. "I have money," Eleanor told me one evening as I helped her prepare for sleep. "Quite a lot of money, actually. Amanda doesn't know how much because she's never asked. She assumes I spent it all on my care, that there's nothing left worth inheriting." "Is there?" I asked gently. Eleanor smiled for the first time since I had known her. "Oh, there's plenty left. More than enough to ensure that whoever inherits it will never have to worry about money again." The will reading took place in Eleanor's hospital room 8 months after I had started caring for her. Eleanor had insisted on changing her will, and her lawyer had come to the hospital with all the necessary documentation. Eleanor was completely lucid, her speech clear and her intentions obvious to everyone present. "I want to leave everything to Madison Chen," Eleanor told her lawyer in my presence. "She's been more family to me in these months than my actual family has been in years." I tried to protest, of course. The idea of inheriting Eleanor's estate felt wrong, inappropriate, like I was taking advantage of a vulnerable patient. But Eleanor was adamant. "You've held my hand through the worst moments of my life," she said to me. "You've listened to my stories, respected my dignity, and treated me like a human being rather than a burden to be managed. That's worth more to me than blood relations that exist only on paper." The lawyer ensured that everything was legally sound. Eleanor was mentally competent. She had no legal obligations to leave her money to Amanda, and her decision was being made freely without coercion. The will was signed, witnessed, and properly notarized. Eleanor died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later. I held her hand as she passed, and her last words were a whispered thank you for giving her dignity in her final months. The reading of Eleanor's will took place the following month. Amanda attended, of course, expecting to inherit whatever small amount remained of her grandmother's estate. She arrived at the lawyer's office in designer clothing, her expression appropriately somber, but with an underlying impatience that suggested she viewed this as a formality. When the lawyer announced that Eleanor Wellington had left her entire estate, including real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets totaling more than $8 million, to Madison Chen, Amanda's reaction was immediate and devastating. She went white as paper, then red with fury. She accused me of manipulation, of taking advantage of a sick old woman, of somehow tricking Eleanor into changing her will. She threatened legal action, demanded investigations, and insisted that the will was invalid due to her grandmother's supposed mental incapacity. But the lawyer had been thorough. Eleanor's mental competency had been documented by multiple physicians. Her decision had been witnessed by hospital staff who could testify to her clarity and determination. The will was ironclad, beyond legal challenge. I tried to explain to Amanda that I had never asked for the inheritance, that I had been as surprised as anyone by Eleanor's decision. But Amanda wasn't interested in explanations. She was interested only in the money she had assumed would eventually be hers, the money she had counted on without ever earning it through genuine care or affection. "You have no right," she screamed at me in the lawyer's office. "She was my grandmother. That money belonged to my family." "Your family abandoned her," I replied quietly. "You told people she was dead rather than admit you had put her in a nursing home." Amanda's face went very still at that. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew about her lies and her systematic abandonment of Eleanor. "She was sick," Amanda said finally. "She required professional care. I made sure she had the best." "You visited her once a month for 30 minutes, I said. "You brought flowers and left. In 18 months, you never once asked her how she was feeling, what she was afraid of, or what she needed from you." The confrontation ended with Amanda storming out of the lawyer's office, threatening lawsuits that never materialized. She was trapped by her own lies. How could she claim to deserve an inheritance from a grandmother she had told everyone was already dead? How could she explain her sudden interest in a woman she had systematically erased from her social circle? But what Amanda didn't know was that Eleanor had shared with me every detail of her granddaughter's deception, the fake obituary Amanda had written and circulated among her friends, the lies she had told about funeral arrangements that never happened, the way she had used Eleanor's stroke as cover for her grandmother's complete disappearance from her life. Eleanor had also shared something else, Amanda's real motivation for abandoning her. It wasn't just shame about having an elderly relative. It was fear that Eleanor's presence would interfere with Amanda's social climbing, her pursuit of wealthy men who might be put off by family obligations to an aging grandmother. "She told me once that old people make others uncomfortable," Eleanor had said. She said it was hard to maintain an attractive image when you're constantly worried about elderly relatives who might become embarrassing or needy. Now, standing in that church with David's wedding folder in my hands, I thought about Eleanor Wellington, about the woman who had died alone because her granddaughter found her inconvenient, about the fortune Amanda had lost through her own cruelty and selfishness. Amanda was staring at me from the altar, her wedding dress suddenly looking less like a symbol of joy and more like a costume in a play that was about to have its final curtain call. She knew that folder contained Eleanor's real will, her real death certificate, and documentation of Amanda's elaborate deception about her grandmother's death. She knew that her lie was about to be exposed in front of everyone who mattered to her, in front of David, in front of her family, in front of the social circle she had worked so hard to impress. But more than that, she knew that the woman she had dismissed as a burden, first her own grandmother, then her future mother-in-law, was about to prove that kindness and dignity have their own power, a power that no amount of social manipulation can ultimately defeat. The silence in St. Matthew's Church was absolute. 200 guests sat frozen in their pews, their faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination to horror. At the altar, David stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process what was happening. Father Mackenzie looked like he was praying this was all a bad dream. And Amanda. Amanda was staring at me with the kind of terror you see in the eyes of someone who realizes their carefully constructed world is about to collapse completely. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church's sound system. "But there are some things that need to be said before these vows are exchanged." "Mom, what are you doing?" David's voice cracked with embarrassment and confusion. "Please sit down. We can talk about whatever this is later." "No, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on Amanda's face. "We can't talk about this later, because later you'll be married to someone who has lied to you about fundamental aspects of who she is." Amanda found her voice then, though it came out higher than usual, strained with panic. "Madison, you're clearly having some kind of episode. David, Your mother needs help. She's disrupting our wedding because she can't handle your happiness. It was a masterful attempt at deflection, exactly the kind of manipulation I had watched her employ for 2 years. Paint me as unstable, frame my objection as mental illness, make David choose between his bride and his supposedly unbalanced mother. But I had spent months preparing for this moment, months thinking through every possible response Amanda might offer. I was ready for her. "Amanda," I said calmly, opening the manila folder in my hands, "would you like to tell David about your grandmother Eleanor, or shall I?" The effect was immediate and devastating. All the color drained from Amanda's face, leaving her looking like a ghost in her wedding dress. Her hands began to shake, and she had to grip David's arm to remain standing. "My grandmother is dead," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "She died 3 years ago." "No," I said, pulling out the first document from my folder. "Eleanor Wellington died 6 months ago on October 15th at Mercy General Hospital. I was her nurse. I held her hand when she passed away." A murmur ran through the congregation. David was looking back and forth between Amanda and me, his face a map of confusion and growing alarm. "That's impossible," Amanda said, but her voice was barely audible now. "You're lying. You're making this up to ruin my wedding." "Am I?" I held up Eleanor's death certificate, official and undeniable. "This is a certified copy of Eleanor Wellington's death certificate. Born February 12th, 1938. Died October 15th, 2022. Daughter of William and Margaret Henderson. Mother of Patricia Wellington, who died in 1995. Grandmother of Amanda Patricia Wellington." I could hear people in the pews whispering to each other, processing this information. Amanda had told everyone her grandmother was dead, had even held a memorial service 3 years ago. Now it turned out the old woman had been alive all that time. "I don't understand," David said, his voice hollow with shock. "Amanda, you said your grandmother died. You had a funeral. I went with you to her memorial service." Amanda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. How could she explain that the memorial service had been fake, that she had pretended her grandmother was dead while the woman was still alive and alone in a care facility? I pulled out the next document. This is Eleanor's admission record to Mercy General Hospital. She was transferred from Sunset Manor Care Facility after her insurance ran out, and her family refused to take responsibility for her continued care. More whispers from the congregation, louder now. The pieces were starting to come together for people, and the picture wasn't pretty. "Amanda visited her grandmother exactly once a month," I continued. 30 minutes each time, always on the same day. Eleanor told me Amanda had informed everyone that she was dead because having an elderly grandmother interfered with the social image Amanda wanted to project. "Stop," Amanda said, her voice breaking. "Please stop." But I wasn't finished. I pulled out another document, this one even more damaging. This is a copy of the obituary Amanda wrote and distributed to her friends and social contacts 3 years ago. "Eleanor Wellington, beloved grandmother, passed away peacefully surrounded by family." Amanda even included details about a funeral service that never happened and requested donations to a charity in Eleanor's name. The church erupted in shocked murmurs. People were turning to each other, processing the magnitude of Amanda's deception. She hadn't just lied about her grandmother's death. She had created an elaborate fiction, complete with fake memorial services and fabricated obituaries. David looked like he had been physically struck. "Amanda, is this true? Did you lie about your grandmother's death?" Amanda's composure finally shattered completely. She began crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration at being exposed. "You don't understand?" she sobbed. "She was old and sick and demanding. She required constant care. It was easier to let people think she had died peacefully than to explain why I had to put her in a facility." "Easier for whom?" I asked quietly. "For everyone," Amanda snapped, her mask slipping completely. "Do you know what it's like to have people constantly asking about your sick grandmother? To have to explain why you can't attend social events because you're dealing with elderly relatives?" It was embarrassing. The word hung in the air like poison. Embarrassing. Amanda had faked her grandmother's death because caring for an elderly relative was embarrassing to her. So you told everyone she was dead while she was still alive and alone in a nursing home, I said. You let her die believing her only family was ashamed of her existence. She was taken care of, Amanda protested weakly. She had professional medical care. She didn't need me there every day. She needed love, I replied. She needed family. She needed to feel like she mattered to someone. Instead, she spent her final months knowing that her granddaughter found her so embarrassing that death was preferable to acknowledging her existence. I pulled out the final document, the one that would end Amanda's deception forever. This is Eleanor Wellington's last will and testament, executed 2 weeks before her death. She left her entire estate, valued at more than $8 million, to Madison Chen, the nurse who treated her with dignity and compassion in her final months. The church fell completely silent. $8 million. Amanda had lost an $8 million inheritance because she was too ashamed to admit her grandmother was alive. David was staring at his bride with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of horror and disgust and profound disappointment. $8 million, he whispered. You lost $8 million because you were embarrassed by your own grandmother. I didn't know she had that much money, Amanda said desperately. She never told me. If you had known, you would have visited more often? I interrupted. You would have pretended to care about her if there was money involved. Amanda's silence was answer enough. She would have, of course. She would have played the devoted granddaughter if she had known about Eleanor's wealth. But she had assumed Eleanor was just another inconvenient elderly relative with no resources worth claiming. Amanda, David said, his voice barely above a whisper, you faked your grandmother's death. You held a memorial service for someone who was still alive. You let me believe I was comforting you through grief while you were lying about everything. I was protecting us, Amanda said, grasping at straws. I was protecting our future together. Old people are complicated, David. They require so much attention and care. I didn't want that burden to interfere with our relationship. Burden. The same word that had been written on my name tag just hours earlier. To Amanda, elderly relatives weren't people deserving of love and respect. They were burdens to be managed or eliminated. Is that what you think of my mother too? David asked, and I could hear the pieces falling into place in his mind. Is that why you gave her a name tag calling her a burden? Because you see all older people as inconvenient obstacles to your perfect life? Amanda's face went white as she realized she had trapped herself. In trying to justify her treatment of Eleanor, she had revealed her fundamental attitude toward anyone who didn't serve her social ambitions. That's different, she said weakly. Your mother is different. How? David demanded. How is my mother different from your grandmother? Because she's not wealthy? Because she worked as a nurse instead of investing in the stock market? Because she spent her life caring for other people instead of accumulating money? Amanda had no answer. There was no answer that wouldn't reveal the depth of her prejudice and selfishness. I looked around the church at the faces of the congregation, Amanda's friends and family members, David's colleagues and law school classmates, people who had come to celebrate what they thought was a joyous occasion. Now they were witnessing the complete destruction of the bride's carefully constructed facade. Some looked shocked, others disgusted. A few seemed almost fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. But everyone understood what they were seeing. A woman who was capable of extraordinary deception and cruelty. Someone who would lie about fundamental aspects of her life to maintain her social position. David, I said gently, you deserve better than this. You deserve someone who loves you enough to be honest with you, someone who would never ask you to choose between your family and your marriage. Amanda made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Madison is manipulating you, she said to David, her voice shrill with panic. She's jealous because you chose me over her. She's trying to destroy our marriage because she can't stand to see you happy. But the spell was broken. David had seen too much, heard too much. The evidence was overwhelming, and Amanda's own words had condemned her more thoroughly than anything I could have said. No, David said quietly. You destroyed our marriage, Amanda. You destroyed it the moment you decided that lying was easier than loving. He reached up and removed the boutonniere from his lapel, letting it fall to the church floor. Then he turned and walked down the aisle, past the shocked congregation, past his bride who was calling after him, past the altar where their future together had just died. I followed him, tucking the documents back into my folder. As I passed Amanda, still standing frozen in her wedding dress, I heard her whisper something that chilled me to the bone. "This isn't over, Madison. You think you've won, but this isn't over." I paused and looked back at her. This woman who had spent 2 years systematically destroying my relationship with my son, who had abandoned her own grandmother out of shame and greed, who had just threatened me even in her moment of complete defeat. "Yes, Amanda," I said quietly, "it is over. It's been over since the moment you decided that human dignity was less important than social status." Then I walked out of that church, following my son into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving Amanda Wellington alone at the altar, with nothing but her wedding dress and the ruins of her carefully constructed lies. I found David in the church parking lot, sitting on the hood of his car with his head in his hands. His expensive tuxedo looked rumpled now, his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his fingers through it. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain I hadn't seen since his father left us. 2 years, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. For 2 years, she's been lying to me about everything. I approached him carefully, unsure of my welcome. The last hour had shattered so many assumptions, destroyed so many carefully constructed barriers between us. I didn't know if David saw me as his ally or as another source of confusion in his suddenly upended world. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said softly. "I know how much you loved her." "Did I?" David laughed bitterly. "How can you love someone you don't actually know? I loved who I thought she was, but that person never existed, did she?" I sat down beside him on the car, grateful when he didn't pull away. "The Amanda you fell in love with existed," I said carefully. "People are complicated. She wasn't pretending to have feelings for you, but she was hiding parts of herself that she knew you wouldn't accept. Like the fact that she's capable of faking her grandmother's death?" David's voice was raw with disbelief. "Like the fact that she systematically destroyed my relationship with my own mother because she found you inconvenient?" I had wondered if David would connect those dots, if he would realize that Amanda's treatment of me was part of the same pattern that had led her to abandon Eleanor. Apparently, he had. "When did it start?" he asked. "The stuff with us, I mean. When did she start poisoning me against you?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without causing him more pain than necessary. "Almost from the beginning," I admitted. "Small things at first. Comments about how tired I looked, suggestions that I might be lonely or depressed. She was very subtle about it, and I believed her." David's voice was filled with self-loathing. "God, Mom, I actually believed her when she said you were becoming demanding and needy. I thought I was protecting myself from an unhealthy relationship with my mother." "She's very good at manipulation," I said. "She convinced you that your natural love and concern for me was actually codependency. She made you feel guilty for wanting to spend time with the woman who raised you." We sat in silence for a while, watching other wedding guests begin to emerge from the church. Some looked shocked, others fascinated by the drama they had witnessed. A few were already on their phones, no doubt sharing the incredible story with people who hadn't been there to see it themselves. "The name tag," David said suddenly. "Burden guest. That wasn't just about the wedding, was it? That's how she sees older people. They're all just burdens to be managed or eliminated." I nodded. "She told me once that old people make others uncomfortable. She said it was hard to maintain an attractive image when you're constantly worried about elderly relatives." Jesus. David buried his face in his hands again. "I was going to marry someone who thinks human beings become disposable when they get old. What does that say about me?" "It says you're trusting," I replied. "It says you believed in the best possible version of someone you loved. That's not a character flaw, David, isn't it?" He looked up at me with eyes that seemed much older than they had that morning. "I chose her over you, Mom. I actually chose her over you. When she made me feel like I had to pick between my fiancé and my mother, I picked her." The admission hung between us like a physical presence. It was the truth we had both been dancing around for 2 years, the fundamental betrayal that had broken my heart and driven us apart. "You were manipulated," I said simply. "Amanda is very skilled at making people see things her way. She made you believe that maintaining a relationship with me was somehow harmful to your future with her." "But I should have seen through it," David insisted. "I should have recognized what she was doing. You're my mother. You worked 3 jobs to put me through college. You never missed a parent-teacher conference or a baseball game. And I let some woman I'd known for 2 years convince me that you were toxic." I reached out and took his hand, the way I used to when he was small and frightened. "People in love make mistakes," I said. "People in love want to believe the best about their partners. Amanda took advantage of that trust." "How much money did you inherit?" David asked suddenly. "From her grandmother, I mean." "More than $8 million, I admitted, plus some real estate and investment accounts. Eleanor was much wealthier than anyone realized." David let out a long, shaky breath. $8 million. Amanda lost $8 million because she was too ashamed to admit her grandmother was alive. "She lost much more than money," I said quietly. "She lost the chance to have a real relationship with someone who loved her." Eleanor talked about Amanda constantly. Even after everything, she still hoped Amanda would come around, would want to be part of her life again. And instead, Amanda let her die alone. "Not alone," I corrected. "I was with her. Other staff members cared about her. She had people who saw her value, who treated her with dignity. But yes, she died without her family." David was quiet for a long time, processing everything he had learned. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, more resolved. "What happens now?" he asked. "With us, I mean." It was the question I had been afraid to hope for. After 2 years of gradual estrangement, after watching my son choose his fiancée over his mother again and again, I hadn't dared to imagine that we might find our way back to each other. "That's up to you," I said. "I never stopped loving you, David. I never stopped wanting to be part of your life. But trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. I want to try," he said immediately. "I want to rebuild what we had, what I threw away for someone who was never worth it." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of high heels clicking rapidly across the asphalt. Amanda was approaching, still wearing her wedding dress but looking far from the radiant bride she had been that morning. Her makeup was smeared from crying, her hair was coming loose from its elaborate styling, and her face was twisted with fury. "This is all your fault," she said to me, her voice shaking with rage. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my life." "You destroyed your own life," David said, standing up from the car. "You destroyed it the moment you decided lying was easier than being honest." "I was protecting us," Amanda insisted, turning to face him. "I was protecting our future. Your mother was never going to accept me, never going to welcome me into the family. She was always going to be a problem." "My mother was welcoming," David replied coldly. "She tried to have a relationship with you. She invited you to dinner, asked about your interests, made effort to connect with you. You were the one who decided she was a problem to be eliminated." "She was competing with me for your attention," Amanda shot back. "Every time we were together, she would find some way to remind you of all her sacrifices, all the things she'd done for you. She was manipulating you with guilt." I started to respond, but David held up his hand to stop me. "No," he said to Amanda. "My mother was being a mother. She was proud of my accomplishments because she had worked her whole life to make them possible. She wanted to be part of my life because she loves me. You saw that love as competition because you're not capable of the same kind of selfless affection." Amanda's face contorted with rage. "Selfless? She's not selfless. She's possessive and controlling and pathetic. Look at her, David. Look at how she lives. She's a lonely old woman who can't let go of her adult son. She's a woman who spent her entire life putting my needs ahead of her own," David replied. "She's a woman who worked as a nurse for 43 years, helping people, saving lives, making a difference. She's a woman who treated your dying grandmother with more kindness and respect than you ever did." "My grandmother was sick and confused," Amanda said desperately. She didn't know what she was doing when she changed her will. Madison took advantage of a vulnerable old woman. Your grandmother was completely lucid, I said quietly. Her lawyer can testify to that. Multiple doctors evaluated her mental capacity. She knew exactly what she was doing when she chose to leave her money to someone who had shown her genuine care and affection. Amanda turned on me then, her composure completely gone. You think you've won, don't you? You think you've gotten your precious son back and destroyed my life in the process. But you haven't won anything. You're still a pathetic old nurse living in a tiny apartment, and now everyone knows it. Actually, I said calmly, I'm a pathetic old nurse living in a tiny apartment who happens to have $8 million, money I plan to use to help other elderly people who have been abandoned by their families. The words hit Amanda like a physical blow. She had lost more than a wedding and a fiancé today. She had lost a fortune that could have set her up for life. Money that was now going to be used for the exact kind of charitable work she found embarrassing and beneath her. This isn't over, she hissed, echoing her earlier threat. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone I know and just walk away? You think there won't be consequences? David stepped between Amanda and me, his face hard with anger I had rarely seen from him. If you come near my mother again, he said quietly, if you contact her, if you harass her, if you so much as drive past her apartment building, I will make sure you regret it. I'm a lawyer, Amanda. I know exactly how to make your life very difficult if you threaten my family. Amanda stared at him for a long moment, perhaps finally realizing that she had lost him completely and irrevocably. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and brittle. Fine, she said. Keep your pathetic mother. You deserve each other. Two losers clinging to each other because nobody else wants you. She turned and walked away then, her wedding dress trailing behind her like the remnants of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. David and I watched her go, neither of us speaking until she had disappeared around the corner of the church. I'm sorry you had to hear that, David said finally. I've heard worse, I replied, though Amanda's words had stung more than I wanted to admit. She's angry and humiliated. People say cruel things when they're backed into a corner. She meant it, though, David said sadly. That's how she really sees us. That's how she's always seen us. We stood there in the parking lot for a while longer, watching the last of the wedding guests drive away. The church bells were ringing 6 o'clock, marking the time when David and Amanda should have been cutting their cake and dancing their first dance as husband and wife. Instead, my son was standing next to me in a rumpled tuxedo, free from a marriage that would have slowly poisoned his soul, finally understanding the difference between love and manipulation. What do you want to do now? I asked him. David looked at me and smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him in months. I want to go home with my mother, he said. I want to sit in your tiny apartment and eat takeout Chinese food and listen to you tell me stories about your patients. I want to remember what it feels like to be with someone who loves me without conditions or calculations. As we walked toward my car together, I thought about Eleanor Wellington, about the woman who had died believing her family was ashamed of her. She would have been happy to know that her death had brought another mother and son back together, that her final act of generosity had exposed the truth and set us all free. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served. And for the first time in 2 years, I was going home with my son. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Eleanor Wellington Memorial Care Center, watching the morning sunlight stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens. The building was beautiful, designed to feel more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility, with comfortable seating areas, artwork on the walls, and the kind of dignified atmosphere Eleanor had dreamed of during her final months. The dedication ceremony starts in 20 minutes, David said, appearing beside me with 2 cups of coffee. He had been my partner in this project from the beginning, handling all the legal aspects of establishing the foundation and converting Eleanor's estate into something that would honor her memory. I accepted the coffee gratefully, still marveling at how natural it felt to have my son back in my life. We had dinner together twice a week now, spoke on the phone almost daily, and had gradually rebuilt the easy companionship that Amanda had worked so hard to destroy. Nervous? David asked, studying my face with the kind of attention he used to pay me when he was young. A little, I admitted. It's strange to think that Eleanor's money is going to help so many families avoid what she went through. She would have been proud of this. The care center was my answer to the problem of elderly abandonment, funded entirely by Eleanor's inheritance. Unlike traditional nursing homes, this facility focused on maintaining dignity and family connections. There were no visiting restrictions, no institutional rules that treated residents like children, and no tolerance for staff members who didn't understand that aging was not a disease to be hidden away. More importantly, we had a family mediation program designed to help repair relationships between adult children and their aging parents. Too many families ended up like Eleanor and Amanda, torn apart by shame, misunderstanding, and the inability to communicate about difficult topics like aging and mortality. Mrs. Chen, a young woman, approached us, holding a clipboard and looking slightly harried. "I'm Sarah, the event coordinator. We're ready whenever you are." I had kept my nursing surname professionally, even after inheriting Eleanor's fortune. Madison Chen was the name I had earned through 4 decades of service, and I saw no reason to change it now. The money had given me options I never thought I would have, but it hadn't changed who I was fundamentally. We walked together toward the main gathering room, where about 50 people had assembled for the dedication ceremony. I recognized some faces from my nursing career, former colleagues who had heard about the foundation and wanted to show their support. Others were families who had already been helped by our mediation program, people who understood the importance of what we were trying to accomplish. There were also reporters present, something I had reluctantly agreed to because David insisted that public awareness would help other families avoid similar tragedies. The story of Amanda's deception had made national news, turning into a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media manipulation and the importance of treating elderly relatives with dignity. As I walked toward the podium, I thought about all the ways my life had changed since that terrible wedding day. The inheritance had given me financial security I had never imagined possible, but more importantly, it had given me purpose. Eleanor's death had not been in vain if it could prevent other families from making the same cruel choices Amanda had made. "Good morning," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the room. 6 months ago, I was working as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital, caring for patients whose families had written them off as burdens. Today, I stand before you as someone who has been given the incredible opportunity to do something about that problem. I looked out at the audience and saw David in the front row, his face glowing with pride. Beside him sat Margaret Chen, my sister, who had flown in from Seattle for the ceremony. Behind them were nurses I had worked with for decades, people who understood better than anyone the tragedy of elderly abandonment. Eleanor Wellington spent the last 18 months of her life believing her granddaughter was ashamed of her existence. I continued. Amanda Wellington told everyone her grandmother was dead, rather than admit she had placed her in a care facility. Eleanor died knowing that the person she had raised and loved found her so embarrassing that death was preferable to acknowledging her existence. The room was completely silent. This was the heart of Eleanor's story, the cruelty that had motivated her to change her will and leave everything to a nurse who had treated her with basic human dignity. But Eleanor's death was not meaningless, I said, my voice growing stronger. Her final act was to ensure that her money would be used to prevent other families from making the same mistakes. The Eleanor Wellington Memorial Care Center is not just a place where elderly people can receive excellent medical care. It's a place where families can learn to communicate with each other, to work through the difficult conversations that aging requires, and to remember that love doesn't expire when someone becomes inconvenient. I paused, looking around the room at the faces watching me. We have a family mediation program here, staffed by social workers and therapists who specialize in intergenerational relationships. We've already helped 37 families rebuild connections that seemed permanently broken. Adult children who thought their parents were becoming burdensome have learned to see them as people deserving of respect. Parents who felt abandoned have reconnected with children who simply didn't know how to handle the fear and sadness that comes with watching someone you love grow old. The applause was warm and sustained. These people understood what we were trying to accomplish. the importance of treating aging as a natural part of life, rather than a shameful failure to be hidden away. After the ceremony, I mingled with the guests, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the foundation's work. It felt surreal to be the center of attention after spending so much of my life invisible, just another nurse in scrubs moving quietly through hospital corridors. "Madison, there's someone here who wants to meet you," David said, approaching with a woman I didn't recognize. She appeared to be in her 40s, well-dressed but with tired eyes that suggested she was dealing with some kind of family stress. "This is Jennifer Walsh," David continued. "She heard about our mediation program and thinks it might help her situation with her mother." Jennifer shook my hand gratefully. "My mother has been living alone since my father died 2 years ago," she explained. "I keep suggesting she might be happier in a community setting, but she insists I'm trying to get rid of her. We barely speak anymore because every conversation turns into an argument about her living situation." It was a familiar story, the kind of conflict that could easily escalate into the sort of estrangement that had destroyed Eleanor and Amanda's relationship. "Have you considered that your mother might be hearing something different than what you're saying?" I asked gently. Jennifer looked confused. "What do you mean?" "When you suggest she might be happier in a community setting, she might be hearing that you think she's becoming a burden," I explained. "When you talk about her living situation, she might be hearing that you're embarrassed by her independence. The words we use matter, but more importantly, the assumptions behind those words matter." "I never thought about it that way," Jennifer said slowly. "I just want her to be safe and happy, but maybe she thinks I want her out of the way. Our program can help you learn to have these conversations in ways that make your mother feel valued rather than dismissed," I said. "It's not about changing what you want for her. It's about changing how you communicate that caring." After Jennifer left with information about our services, David and I walked through the gardens behind the care center. The landscaping was Eleanor's idea, based on descriptions she had given me of the garden she had maintained at her own home before her stroke. She had loved roses, and we had planted dozens of varieties in her memory. "She would have loved this," David said, echoing my thoughts from earlier. "The whole place, but especially these gardens. She would have loved knowing that her death prevented other families from going through what she did with Amanda," I replied. "That was what mattered most to her in the end. Not the money, not even getting recognition for her generosity. Just the hope that other people wouldn't have to die feeling unloved and abandoned." We sat down on one of the benches overlooking the rose garden. It was a peaceful spot, the kind of place where families could have difficult conversations without feeling rushed or pressured. Everything about the care center was designed to facilitate connection rather than separation. "Have you heard from Amanda?" David asked. It was a question he posed periodically, usually with the same tone of concerned watchfulness. "No," I said. "And I don't expect to. Her threat that day in the parking lot was just anger talking. She's moved on, probably found some other wealthy man to marry." It was true, as far as I knew. Amanda had left town within a month of the wedding disaster, supposedly to take a job with a luxury hotel chain in Florida. David's law firm contacts had kept an eye on her for a while, but she seemed to have genuinely disappeared from our lives. "I hope she learned something from all this," David said. "I hope she understands now what she lost by treating people the way she did." I wasn't as optimistic as my son about Amanda's capacity for growth, but I didn't see any point in sharing that pessimism. Some people learn from their mistakes and become better humans. Others simply become more careful about hiding their true nature. I suspected Amanda fell into the latter category. "What about you?" I asked David. "Any regrets?" David was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret the time we lost," he said finally. "I regret letting her manipulate me into thinking you were the problem. But I don't regret that the whole thing happened, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," I replied. "Sometimes we have to lose something to understand its true value." As the afternoon wound down and the last of the ceremony guests departed, David and I locked up the care center and prepared to go our separate ways. He had a date that evening, something that had been happening more frequently since his split with Amanda. He was dating a social worker now, someone who understood the value of family connections and who had been enthusiastic about the foundation's work from the beginning. "Dinner tomorrow?" David asked as we reached our cars. "I want to hear how the first week of residence goes." "Of course," I said. "Same time, same place?" We had developed a routine of meeting at a small cafe near my apartment every Tuesday evening. Nothing fancy, just a place where we could talk without interruption and continue the slow process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation. Driving home that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I had been a retired nurse living on a modest pension, estranged from my only child and facing an uncertain future. Today, I was the founder of a charitable organization that was already making a difference in people's lives, reconnected with my son, and surrounded by meaningful work that honored Eleanor's memory. The money had made many things possible, but it wasn't the money that had transformed my life. It was the truth about Amanda's manipulation, about Eleanor's abandonment, about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their age or social status. My phone rang as I was unlocking my apartment door. David's name appeared on the screen. "I forgot to tell you," he said when I answered. "I got a call from a journalist today. She wants to do a follow-up story about the foundation for a national magazine. Are you interested?" I thought about it for a moment. Public attention still felt strange and uncomfortable, but if it helped other families avoid Eleanor's fate, it was worth the discomfort. "Yes," I said. "If it helps people understand what we're trying to do here, I'm interested." After I hung up, I made myself a simple dinner and settled onto my couch with a book. My apartment was still small and modest, largely unchanged since my nursing days. The inheritance had given me the option to buy a larger place, something more befitting my new financial status, but I had chosen to stay. This was home, the place where I had grieved my failed marriage and celebrated David's achievements, where I had worried about his future and eventually welcomed him back into my life. Outside my window, the city continued its evening routine. People coming home from work, families gathering for dinner, the ordinary rhythms of life that I had once watched from the outside. Now I was part of something larger, connected to a community of people working to solve problems that mattered. The last thing I did before bed was look at the photograph I kept on my nightstand. Eleanor Wellington in her hospital bed, smiling despite her frailty, holding my hand with surprising strength. She had been proud of the foundation plans, excited about the possibility that her death might prevent other families from making Amanda's mistakes. "Thank you, Eleanor," I whispered to the photograph. "Thank you for trusting me with your story, and thank you for giving me the chance to make sure it ends better for other people." Then I turned off the light and settled into sleep, surrounded by the quiet peace that comes from knowing your life has purpose, your family loves you, and your work makes a difference in the world. It had been a long journey from that humiliating wedding day to this moment of contentment, but every step had been worth it. The burdened guest had become something much more powerful. I had become a woman who knew her worth, demanded respect, and used her resources to lift up others who had been forgotten or dismissed. Eleanor would have been proud, and for the first time in years, so was I.